Parsha of Noah. It also serves as the haftorah later in Chumash Dvorim for the Parsha of Seitzei. The haftorah is from the Novi Yeshayahu, from the prophet Isaiah, and is one of the most exalted prophecies that we have in the Tanakh. We'll discuss with you in a few moments why it is chosen as the prophecy for the Parsha of for the haftorah of the Parsha of Noah. But due to the fact that it has to do with words of comfort, words of strength, it can be very clear to us why it is that, because the Parsha of Noah describes this destruction of humanity, the destruction of the world. And this chapter of comfort is comfort for all of humanity, even though it is centralized in the story of the Jewish people. The haftorah begins, Roni akora lo yoloda. Roni, rejoice, you who are an akora, a woman who is barren, lo yoloda, who has not given birth. Or better still, a woman who cannot give birth. The imagery always in Tanakh of the Jewish people is that we have no future. And that is always the imagery of an akora, of a barren person. Because there's no future. And if we look in history, or we look at our destiny, it becomes clear why we come to that realization, because on the basis of logic, on the basis of what happens to everybody else, there is no reason in the world that there should be a future for the Jewish people. Surrounded by enemies, hounded by internal problems, buffeted by all the forces that exist in the world, how can we predict that tomorrow we will be here? How can we predict that we have any future? So therefore we are always compared to people without a future. Our rabbis tell us that therefore the mothers of Israel, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, were all described in the Tanakh as being women who were barren, women that did not have the ability to have children, and yet miraculously from each one the household of Israel was perpetuated. Each one was able to have children, a child who through his greatness was able to continue the chain of tradition and the chain of the Jewish people. So the Novi says to the Jewish people, you who have no future, who are a barren woman, Pitzchi Rina, open your mouth in song. V'tzahali. Tzahali is almost to laugh out loud. Lo cholam. You who are lo chola, a woman that was not able to experience the pangs of labor. Ki rabim b'nei shomema mi b'nei be'ula omar Hashem. Because God says at the end of days, there will be more children from the woman that was barren than from the woman that was fruitful. Meaning at the end of days, the end of time, we will see at the end of history who is around, who is here, who has survived and who has not survived. And therefore God says we'll wait and see, which is in essence the Jewish viewpoint of all of our matters and all of our enemies. Yiddish has a great phrase, we can warten, der warten. If one can wait, then if you can wait it out, then that's it. That's a great rule in raising children. That's a great rule in many, many things in life. Most of life is patience, the ability to wait the thing out. And it is not easy to do. Because of the fact that we are so limited in our time and we always are under pressure, it's very hard to wait. Very hard to have patience, very hard to sit back and see what's going to happen. But the Navi, who represents God, so to speak, the prophet, they have time, right? God has time. God says, what are you nervous? Wait, we'll see, right? Then we'll see who is here at the end, who has survived. I mentioned it a number of times that on the tour that the shul went to the Metropolitan Museum to see the exhibition on the artifacts of the Holy Land, a marvelous exhibition. So one of the exhibits there is a bronze statue of the Emperor Hadrian that was found in Caesarea, unearthed and polished and mounted, and he is there in all of his glory. Now the Emperor Hadrian was the emperor who put down the rebellion of Bar Kokhba. He was the man who executed Rabbi Akiva and all of the other heroes of Israel. He was a cruel, ruthless tyrant, and he attempted to obliterate not only the Jewish religion but the Jewish people. He was out to end the Jewish problem. He was the first in a long line of people who were going to solve the Jewish problem. And the curator of the Metropolitan Museum, who narrates the tape that you rent the tape recording and you walk along with it, cassette, in order to help explain the exhibits. And the curator is also not known as a pro-Israel person at all. They had the whole fight about whether having the exhibit that was postponed for 2.5 years because some of the artifacts came from the West Bank. The West Bank is not Israel, that whole baloney. It took a lot of Jewish money to convince him otherwise. That's probably the largest bonanza in the history of the Metropolitan Museum. Anyway, he narrates it, so at the end of his description of this bronze statue of the Emperor Hadrian, he says that this is the only statue extant that we have of the emperor that shows his full face and all of his features, etc. Even in Rome, nowhere else do we have a statue of his likeness. And he said it is an irony of history that he now enjoys a benign captivity in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. So that's what the Navi says here. We'll wait. God says, we'll wait. We'll see at the end who is around. The end will be that there will be more children from those, more survivors from those that were barren, that had no future, than from those who were so numerous and powerful and so strong and have disappeared from the scene. It's really one of the great lessons of history, and it's one of the amazing lessons is that people never take it to heart. It seems to be already such an obvious lesson, and yet neither the Jewish world nor the non-Jewish world takes it to heart. The Navi says you will have to expand the places of your tents. You'll have to make them larger. And the curtains that are your dwelling places, you'll have to bend them over to make room. Al tachsochi, don't spare, don't make it small. Harichi meisarayich, make the ropes longer. Yiseidosaich hazeki, and make your foundation strong, because you'll have to add stories upon stories. You'll have to add apartments upon apartments. Now, again, we have lived to see how the words of the Navi are literally interpreted by the events of our time. In 1936, England sponsored a report by a man called Loudermilk, the Loudermilk report, that said that under the best of circumstances, Palestine could support a population of 600,000 people. And since there were already 600,000 people there, not Jews, but 600,000 people, including the Arabs, so therefore the only hope was to shut off all immigration. And the most optimistic of the Zionist reports said it could take 1 million people, 1.5 million people. 2 million people. We now live to see a state of Israel has 4 million people. And we are convinced that there's room for many, many more. The Talmud says that the land of Israel is compared to the hide of the deer, which is elastic. As long as it's on the deer, it's taut. But once you stretch it, then it stretches to many times its original configuration. So that's what the Navi says here. The Navi says at the end, don't plan on a small Israel. Don't plan on small things. You'll have to expand the places of your tents. You'll have to build stronger foundations. You'll have to build for the future, not just for the present. If you go to the land of Israel today, you see how true it is. You see many times institutions built for themselves very large buildings that sometimes look to be disproportionate to the actual necessity of the institution. You have to remember that what is built in Israel is not built for now. What is built in Israel is built permanently. And therefore there will be a time that no question that the building will be full. There's no question that it will all be taken up. When we build in the exile, we build only temporarily. Even if it be Muncie and Borough time. It is still only temporary. No one should fool themselves to think otherwise. Yomin small tifrosi. I have only forsaken you for an instant in time, or for a moment I have, so to speak, lost my temper. But I shall gather you to me in great mercy, great meaning extended in time and in quality. And Forsham Seder, Bon Shalom goes through the world and he picks up every little Jew from wherever he is, from Tasmania and from Borneo and from South Africa, from the ends of the world, from Little Rock, from the ends of the world, God finds Jews. I will pick you up. I will gather you. And we have lived to see how true that is also, not only in the general sense of the ingathering of the exiles, but in the particular sense of individuals who have no connection to Judaism whatsoever, and all of a sudden there they are. And God has brought them home. What was one of my favorite stories about a friend of mine who for one summer volunteered as an NCSY director, and he worked out of St. Louis, Missouri. And he was traveling from St. Louis to the West Coast, and he was driving through Hutchinson, Kansas. And his car broke down in Hutchinson, Kansas. And he brought it into the garage, and the guy in the garage said he can't fix it today, it'll take all day tomorrow, he's got to sleep overnight. And so he looks up in the phone in Hutchinson, Kansas. He tries to look up Jewish names. He looks up Cohen, Levy, he can't find anybody. Finally finds a name that he thinks is Jewish. And he calls up on the phone, and he says, my name is so-and-so, and I'm passing through town, and excuse me, but, I thought you were Jewish, and could you put me up for the night? So the people were, it doesn't usually happen in Hutchinson, Kansas, but they said, okay, come over. Not a kosher home. But they were Jewish, right? So they gave him a bed in the guest room. And they had a 12 or 13-year-old boy, and overnight he made friends with him. And he made friends with him. He had a tremendous influence on him in one day. And the end of the story is that boy from Hutchinson, Kansas is not ahead of a kollel in Yerushalayim. So God sent him to Hutchinson, Kansas to pull him out. Why? What the accounting is, how that works, I don't know. But I had the same experience this week. The story's not over yet, but I had such an experience this week that in the yeshiva, in the gym, so over the protests of many, I allowed somebody to make to run a karate class there for boys. So they run a karate class for younger boys and for teenage boys. Yeah. I don't have to explain my motives, but they're not monetary. But no, not Jewish defense either? Okay, fine. This week I went to lecture somewhere. I went to lecture for JEP, for the Jewish Education Program. And there's always a very nice crowd that's there, etc. But I recognize most of the people, one way or another. I see there's a new person there, completely new person. I've never seen him in all the years that I'm there. And he sits through the whole lecture, and after the lecture he comes up and he thanks me for the lecture. And he signs up with Mr. Rothbard for this course, etc. And then he says to me, you know what I'm doing here? I don't know what you're doing here. I don't even know who you are. He said, I'll tell you what. He said, I brought my son to the karate class that's in your building. And I thought to myself, if he's nice enough to give the building for the karate class, so I saw that you're speaking this week, so I wanted to come hear you. So I don't know what the end of it is. So maybe that's the end of the story for all I know, right? That also could be. But it's also something. But what the Novi is trying to tell us is that you never know. Right? You never. That's the basic rule in Jewish life, is that you never know what you're going to do, and you never know why. We always think that we know what we're doing, and we know where we're going. We get up in the morning, we know exactly, right? the day doesn't always turn out the way we thought it was going to. And that's true of every